سيد الرئيس، إن بلادي سوريا تنزف.
Mr. President, my country, Syria, is the people of Syria are the first victims. I address you today at this time, and at this very time, there has been an explosion, and martyrs and wounded are suffering. Families are being displaced. I regret, Mr. President, to convey to you, on behalf of the suffering people, the events of this morning. The city of Katana, in the southeast of Damascus, suffered a terrorist explosion this morning in front of a school, where dozens of children and their families perished. Yesterday, there were 8 explosions affecting other regions of the capital, Damascus, and which have also resulted in many deaths. Mr. President, I will not dwell here from this podium to explain the results of all of these terrorist events and all of those who support them, be they states or groups. I will simply mention the extremely negative impact of such terrorist acts, their impact on the lives of citizens by causing explosions in power centers, in energy centers, and also by stealing fuel reserves and causing explosions in gas and oil pipelines, clinics and schools. All of this in order to shock society and produce chaos, terror, and terrorize the citizens.
Allow me, Mr. President, to reaffirm the Syrian Arab Republic's deep belief in the importance of coordinating humanitarian efforts that aim to provide aid to the citizens that have been affected in cases of emergencies. And this is based on GA Resolution 46/182, which establishes the mandate of the OCHA and which regulates its operations. I would also like to take this opportunity to reaffirm the Syrian government's complete readiness to cooperate with international organizations working in Syria in light of our obligation, in light of their obligations towards their mandates and the guiding principles adopted by GA resolutions of relevance pertaining to enhancing coordination of humanitarian aid offered by the United Nations in cases of emergencies, especially those pertaining to the need to fully respect the state's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity, and the non-interference in their internal affairs, in line with the Charter, of course. Mr. President, dear colleagues, the government of Syria, throughout the current and painful crisis, has offered every facility to provide speedy assistance and aid to its citizens out of its national obligations and its responsibility and duty towards them. And for this very purpose, a committee was formed to follow up the humanitarian conditions of affected citizens. be that in terms of offering food and medical and shelter aid to them, or in terms of compensating them for damages that they have incurred as a result of the practices of the armed terrorist groups. Our government has also helped rehabilitate infrastructure in order to resume providing health and social services. We have also formed a committee, a higher committee for aid, in order to coordinate aid efforts offered to those affected. And as a result of the great efforts exerted by the Syrian government under extremely difficult circumstances, approximately 547 temporary shelters have been opened using all available government buildings. In addition to this national effort, the government of Syria cooperated with the United Nations Office for Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, as well as the High Commissioner for Refugee Affairs and the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Syrian government has offered all forms of facilitations in order to facilitate access to human assistance by affected citizens throughout the country. We have also completed the amended plan to respond to humanitarian needs inside Syria. The government has issued licenses to over 80 NGOs, allowing them to participate with the UN agencies in the response efforts. The Syrian government continues to offer all forms of facilitation to those working in humanitarian aid. It also issues licenses for the OCHA to perform field visits in many areas inside Syria without any delay. My country, Syria, as you know, has participated constructively in 6 meetings of the Humanitarian Forum that were held on Syria in Geneva. However, this government effort in the humanitarian arena faces extremely negative obstacles that are embodied in the continuation of countries known to support terrorism in my country, their continuation in funding and arming and protecting armed terrorist groups in Syria. I would like to read to you what was said by the chairman of the International Red Cross Committee, Mr. Peter Mauro, yesterday in Geneva. And I quote, "The situation in Syria is exceptional because of the intensity of battles raging throughout the country. Moreover, and also because of the involvement of some regional and international powers in the country." End of quote. Mr. President, it is truly ironic that 6 press statements in the Security Council have been hindered and have been obstructed, and these statements were condemning terrorist bombings that were perpetrated by a terrorist group related to Al-Qaeda, calling itself Jabhat al-Nusra, which has declared since October 2011 that it has perpetrated approximately 600 attacks, ranging from more than 40 suicide attacks, as well as other operations where it used small weapons as well as primitive explosive devices in main urban centers, including the capital Damascus and the cities of Hama, Aleppo, Daraa, and Homs, and Idlib, and Deir ez-Zor. These attacks have killed many innocent Syrians. One of the very states that obstructed the issuance of these 6 press statements in the Security Council, one of these states that then obstructed the issuance of press statements, it then places this same terrorist organization on its national list of terrorist organizations. From the very beginning of the crisis, ladies and gentlemen, we have worked on drawing the attention of member states to the presence of an armed terrorist interference dimension, or dimension that interferes in our internal affairs. However, we ran up against the wall of political pride as well as ignorance of geopolitical conditions and a large-scale media fabrication, which has led many top officials in this international organization to deny reality and to arrive at mistaken conclusions as to the developments in the Syrian crisis. And this caused the United Nations, starting with the Secretary General himself and going through his top aides and ending with his special envoys and representatives. They have spent more than a year to finally admit and shyly the presence of what they call a third element, and this is a polite expression and a euphemism for armed terrorist groups. It took them another 6 months to go from admitting that there is a third element in the Syrian crisis to admitting the presence of armed groups. They then spent 3 more months as the blood of the Syrian people was shed before they admitted the presence of terrorist organizations related to Al-Qaeda. This means that the Syrian people, ladies and gentlemen, suffered from terrorism for 21 months while they waited for the United Nations to heed their cries and as member states to heed their cries and their agony and their tears because of an organized terrorism that was clear from the very start and which was supported by foreign and sadly Arab and sadly regional and international forces. Mr. President, dear colleagues, the Syrian government's full cooperation with the humanitarian response plan which it signed with the OCHA has regrettably been met with weak funding, which obstructs joint efforts to implement the amended response plan and meeting humanitarian needs. While the Syrian government plays the primary role in meeting the main needs and basic needs of its citizens, the pledges made by donors in the media and in several international fora, these pledges have not been met. And this is proven in the statements and reports of the OCHA itself. The most recent of which was the report dated the 11th of December 2012, the day before yesterday, which indicates that only half the required funding has been received so far in order towards the humanitarian response inside Syria. Only 35% of the funding required to respond to the needs of Syrian refugees has been supplied so far. The OCHA report that I've just mentioned also notes the need, also notes that the World Food Programme had to decrease the rations that it disseminates because of the lack of funding, and this has led to slow implementation and the inability to meet the minimum requirements of the minimum humanitarian requirements of those affected by the events. And this has also cast shadows of doubt on the true care that some countries claim for the well-being of Syrian citizens. Moreover, the continued imposition of packages of unilateral economic coercive measures outside the framework of international legitimacy by some hegemonic states, and by some regional groups, the imposition of these measures on Syria has greatly contributed to the deterioration of Syrian citizens' living conditions, and it has limited the ability to offer basic services to citizens and obstructed efforts exerted to import medicines as well as medical supplies and spare parts needed to ensure the continued operation and maintenance of public facilities. Moreover, these unilateral economic coercive measures, which are adopted in packages, have led, and this is an example, to the increased rate of foreign currency, and this has led to a decrease in the Syrian pound's purchasing power and an increase in inflation, and this has also made it difficult to fund imports and to fund investment projects, and led to shortages in investment resources. This also led to an increased rate of unemployment and poverty. What is important here, Mr. President, is that those who are imposing these coercive measures with one hand also claim to offer humanitarian aid with the other hand, and this same body is this same party is the symbol for political hypocrisy and lies, and the states that are imposing these coercive measures want to transform the people of Syria from a productive and generous people who over the past years have achieved an economic growth and renaissance that achieved food sufficiency and exported many of its surplus to the world. They want to transform this people from a productive people to a people that survives on aid. Mr. President, the government of Syria has called upon its people who have been forced by difficult circumstances to leave the country to neighboring states. We have called upon them to return to their homeland and to their homes in order to live in dignity in their homeland and away from the abuse of terrorist organizations and those who support them, the abuse of their pain, and in order to prevent them from falling into the hands of those who practice humanitarian blackmail. The Syrian government has allocated aid and assistance to all citizens whose houses have been damaged so that these houses can be rebuilt and they can continue their life in a dignified manner on their homeland. And this is a citizen's right that the government must fulfill. Here I would like to note that the abominable manipulation of the numbers of Syrian refugees, which some parties are committing, is a barbaric behavior and blackmails the integrity and dignity of the Syrian human. Some states are providing escalating numbers of the numbers of Syrian refugees in their territories. And in the meantime, the High Commissioner for Refugee Affairs, and we thank it for this, submits a report dated yesterday, December 12th, that notes that only 40% of Syrian refugees in the region are present in refugee camps, while the majority of refugees are outside of refugees and mostly live in rented residences or with host families. And this is what the High Commissioner for Refugees states in its report. High Commissioner, I beg your pardon. In closing, there is no need to clarify that the remaining 60% of Syrians who were forced to leave their homeland because of the crisis, this portion lives in hotels and spend Syrian money that would nourish the economies of the states that they are residing in. In any case, and regardless of the efforts that have been exerted by states hosting those Syrian citizens, we say to them, thank you. But we urge them and call upon them to deal with this humanitarian issue in an objective manner and with integrity and with a sound conscience. Because what these states who are hosting Syrian refugees and citizens are gaining much more from these Syrians than the burden they claim to have come under because of the presence of some refugee camps. In conclusion, Mr. President, I would like to stress on behalf of my government that solving the humanitarian crisis in Syria is not done by political blame games that some member states are practicing in order to settle some old and new scores. It cannot be solved by the flames or by fanning the flames of ethnic and religious discord and by funding and protecting armed terrorists and forcing them and encouraging them to perpetrate massacres and bombings and terrorist attacks against Syrian citizens. The solution to the crisis in Syria can be achieved by abiding to the principles of offering humanitarian assistance. And we would like to cite here specifically Resolution 46/182 and by the presence of political will among the donor states and bodies to fulfill the pledges that they have promised to send and to put an end to the policy of imposing unilateral coercive economic measures which primarily affect the Syrian people and harm them severely. This is what we have to say on the humanitarian level. As for the political level, there are efforts, welcome efforts, that the Special Envoy, Mr. Lakhdar al-Ibrahimi, is exerting, and he enjoys international consensus. And all the Syrian people wish for from the so-called international community is to support the efforts of Lakhdar al-Ibrahimi. Not for some parties to help Lakhdar al-Ibrahimi in public while undermining what he is doing in secret. We want honest and objective help to us as a government and the people and the opposition so that we can arrive at the shores of safety. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, and I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative.